Hello and welcome to another episode of PPC Town Hall. My name is Fred Valles. I'm the host of this session. I'm one of the co-founders of Optmyzr as well. So today's going to be a fun one because we're going to be talking about a topic that, quite honestly, nobody knows very much about, but it's hugely critical to the future of PPC. As you've all seen, new browsers have come along. They're starting to block third-party cookies. There's privacy laws coming left and right. The world is just fundamentally changing. And some of the things that we as PPC practitioners have been able to use for the past 20 or so years, because privacy regulations were pretty lax and because third-party cookies were available to us, well, those things are soon going to go away. So that changes the game for all of us. And again, we don't have all the answers, but we do know a lot of the things that are changing, some of the things Google is thinking about, and that's what this session is about today. So we're going to be talking about the end of third-party cookies, the introduction of FLoC, the introduction of TURTLEDOVE. If you don't know what those terms are, don't worry. We're going to explain it. We're going to keep it non-technical, and we're going to try to make it actionable. So we're going to tell you what you can do to start preparing for these things. So welcome to another episode of PPC Town. And a big welcome to our guests today, Navah, Hopkins, and Amy. So good to see both of you. Thanks for coming back on the show.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, right. Thank you for having us.
Yeah. Navah, let's start with you. So since the last time we had you on the show, you transitioned roles working for a new company. So tell us a little bit about what you're up to these days.
Sure. So Justuno is actually, Justuno got me specifically because of what we're about to talk about. So they are a CRO suite that helps folks earn that first-party data, create amazing converting experiences, enhance the path to conversion. And my role there is to actually be a liaison between the paid media community and their tool. They have a phenomenal suite of CRO on-page optimizations, but more importantly, they are able to help that cross-platform conversation. So as we think about attribution, as we think about generating those first-party data pieces, I am helping them help all of us get ahead of FLoC, get ahead of that potential retargeting death.
All right, sounds like the right time to make that sort of a move. Exciting company, so thanks for joining us. Amy Bishop, stuff is new in your life as well, right? Still cultivative marketing, but you've also taken on a new role, I think, at SCJ. So tell us a little bit about what's going on with you.
Yeah, that's right. So I'm still heading up Cultivative, which is a paid search consultancy. But recently, I've also started working with SCJ to help with their paid media news coverage, which has been really exciting, really fun. Just kind of helps keep me on top of everything, as opposed to reading what other people have shared. Now I'm kind of responsible for coming up with the articles and writing those myself. So it's a great way to make sure that I'm always staying on top of any new information that's coming out.
Nice. So you're the new Susan Winograd or the new Ginny Marvin, I guess.
Yeah, those are really big shoes to fill. So I don't know if I could call myself the new one of either of those ladies, but I definitely aspire one day to maybe fill those shoes.
Exactly. Starting to fill them and then on to greater and better things. Well, great to have both of you on the show. Before we get into the topic of FLoC, I did want to make an announcement. So Optmyzr is going to be hosting its first ever user conference. It's going to be called Unlevel. And we have some great speakers for it. So we're very fortunate. We have John Lee from Microsoft. We have Navah, who's on the show today. Many other great speakers. This is going to be a free event. It's going to be happening on May 18th. It may not work for everybody's time zones, but because it's on demand, we do want people to register and come check it out because we're going to have some great educational content. And that's really one of the things we do at PPC Town Hall and that we're also very big on at Optmyzr is PPC is honestly an exciting space because it changes so often, but it also means we have to do a lot of work ourselves to keep on the cutting edge. And so we just wanted to make that easier, especially in the pandemic days when it's very difficult to go to in-person conferences, even to this day. So we're going to be putting on a virtual event. If you're an existing user of Optmyzr, you're going to get a benefit of access to a special track, which is our roadmap track, where you're going to be able to work directly with our product managers, give feedback to them, and hear what they're working on. If you're not an existing Optmyzr user, join us as well. Again, it's free. You're going to hear some of the big topics in the industry and also get to explore a little bit about what Optmyzr is about. So we'll have the landing page for that. You can start signing up, and that'll be happening in a few weeks. So we're super excited about that. All right, but oh yeah, and the other thing, lots of people viewing live today, so that's fantastic. So tell us where you're calling in from. Say hello using the comment section. That is also how you can ask us questions and start contributing to the conversation here and steer us in the direction that you want, right? Tell us what you want to know more about, or tell us if we're losing you and then you got some specific questions. We'll show that on screen with your picture. So let's make it interactive and engaging. But with that, I figured we start maybe, Amy, could you talk us through a little bit about like, why are we having a session on FLoC? What's changing? What is FLoC all about? And why is it important?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've known for a while that third-party cookies were going away. What we maybe didn't know was exactly how those would be replaced. So earlier this year, Google announced they won't build alternative identifiers to try to track individuals around the web. And instead, they introduced FLoC. FLoC stands for Federated Learning of Cohorts. FLoC is designed to aggregate data about groups of people in order to continue to support advertisers through cohorts. So cohorts would be a variation of kind of what we would typically think of as audiences. And so they would create these cohorts while still protecting the privacy of the people in these cohorts, while allowing monetization use cases such as interest-based advertising, ads measurement, reporting, and other scenarios like that we've come to rely on third-party cookies for.
Yeah, and so we're going to spend a few minutes here setting a bit more context. But so Navah, like, explain to us first-party and third-party cookie, and like why do people hate third-party cookies so much?
Sure. So when we think about first party versus third party is data that you own. You have created an experience that the user is willing to give you that information, and also it is the user has completed actions on your site. So the ability to have just analytics of did a shopping cart belong to a user, and just being able to pick out that information. Did traffic happen on your site? You will still be able to see. And if you were able to earn that email, you were able to create that bond, you will still be able to target through things like customer match and customer audiences on those third-party sites and through the ad networks. Third-party data is when a user does something, you used to be able to, and you still to a certain extent are able to, as it's being depreciated, nag the user as they would go to these other sites to remind them to go get your product, to remind them to complete the purchase, to remind them to go do XYZ thing. So third-party data was basically any data that you did not specifically own. So think about buying email lists, think about publishers that you just you don't own the channel, so you can't control what's there. So when we think about first-party data versus third-party data, a good way to think about it is first-party data is that trusted relationship that a person has opted in to talk to you. Third-party data is kind of the ticket blocker or scalper trying to get you to buy the ticket.
Right, because the ticket scalper knows you just showed up to the arena and
Exactly.
you might be interested in a ticket. And so the example in PPC would be, I've been on Edmunds.com, I've been on Cars.com, so I'm clearly shopping for a new car. And then out of left field, some like Mercedes dealership comes in and says, "Hey, Fred, here's an ad for you. Do you want to buy this car?" And it's like, whoa, like why does Mercedes know that I've been shopping for a car because I haven't been to that website?
Well, one thing, and I hope we'll all dive into this, and this might be kind of jumping ahead of the desired agenda, but there is this idea with cohorts being very similar to in-market audiences, custom intent audiences. So the ability to still say, "Hey, Fred, you seem like you're interested in cars," but it won't be, "Hey, Fred," it'll be Fred amongst 1,000, 2,000, 5,000, 10,000 other people that show similar browsing behavior. So you still will be able to have that contextual targeting. It's just not going to be, "Hey, you looked at that 2015. you seemed like you were really interested in financing options. Here's a very specific offer to you based off of the exact things that you did.
Right. And Amy,
Yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think maybe it might help to talk just about a little bit about how exactly FLoC replaces cookies. And maybe I should have covered this in kind of the initial piece that I gave. But the big difference is that cohorts are built within the browser using on-device processing to keep each person's history private on the browser. So Chrome browsers specifically, we're specifically talking about Chrome when we're talking about FLoC. They will use algorithms to create a very large number of cohorts based upon people that kind of share the same interests, but each person's cohort information and their individual browsing history is kept private. So only their browser itself within that specific device will be able to look at their history and then assign them to a cohort. So essentially your browser determines which cohort corresponds to your recent web browsing history, grouping you with thousands of other people, so that then when you're visiting a site, that site has the ability to ask your browser which cohort you belong to, and then your browser will give them an identification number of the cohort, and then it's essentially giving them only that little piece of information, as opposed to third-party cookies, which would have allowed companies to kind of follow you individually across different sites around the web. So FLoC essentially works on your device without your browsing history being shared. So to give a more specific example, like for instance, when you're browsing Chrome, it will tell that site that you're part of this specific cohort number, and then it's up to that website to actually know what that cohort number means. So for instance, if that cohort number means that I'm interested in, to your point, like Mercedes, then it's going to give like an ID like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and it's going to tell the website this person is part of cohort 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then that website has to take that information and determine what ad to show based upon that. But they're not going to receive any more context about me or my browsing habits or what else that I've looked at. So it's a lot more private than what third-party cookies used to be and what used to be shared as part of that.
So that raises the big question. Okay, so I'm an advertiser. I go into Google, I'm like, okay, I want in-market car buyers for a specific brand. That's my audience. Go and show my ads. Easy. And now you're kind of saying that as an advertiser, I'm going to have to be like, I want to target 123 AW 926.
Yeah. And so
how do we do that?
I think from an advertiser standpoint, especially since we'll be, for many of us that are working through the Google Ads platform, it's going to probably be made simple for us. I would say where some of the pain points are going to lie are going to be on some of the other ad serving platforms that are going to have to figure out how to decode this and make something of it. So I think from an advertiser standpoint, I actually believe that the impact is less for the advertisers as it is for some of the other folks that are involved and accustomed to using third-party cookies.
And does that perhaps start touching a little bit about Bernanke? And I don't know if we want to talk about that here for a second, right? But so Bernanke is this thing that came out in the past week or so through a Texas lawsuit against Google, where it sounds like Google is giving itself an unfair advantage in the auction for display network. And so you're kind of saying the same thing might happen here in the roundabout way. So if you're on Google, because it's Google having built these cohorts, they can tell you maybe what's in these cohorts. Whereas if you're off Google, you don't have quite the same information. And what is Bernanke?
Yeah, and it's hard to say. You know, I don't want to make accusations because there's just too little information for us to really know. But just to kind of, I do think there's potentially some things that are coincidentally close here. So just for like a little bit of background, Texas is leading a multi-state lawsuit against Google. And the original complaint that was filed in December claims that Google uses its monopoly power to control pricing and engage market collusion to rig auctions. That same filing mentions a project which was codenamed Jedi Blue, and that was an agreement between Google and Facebook where essentially Facebook agreed not to compete too heavily with Google, but in exchange for preferential treatment on Google's advertising network. And I believe there was also a minimum spend that Facebook also agreed to hit in order to make it worth Google's while. But anyway, as part of this ongoing lawsuit, Google filed documents, presumably accidentally, that were unredacted. And they detailed Project Bernanke, which is what we're talking about here. And Project Bernanke was said to be an internal Google program which allegedly made use of data from publishers as well as competitor bidding models to try to determine their bids for specific placements. And initially, it really made it sound like it was kind of for Google's own promotion of Google, but I really am pretty sure that it's more of Google's promotion of its ad network in kind of comparison to either other networks or in comparison to other exchanges. Essentially, they were using this data to make sure that the clients on their exchanges were getting these placements at the best prices compared to what other competitors were.
Interesting. And I mean, I think it's, again, to the point that things are becoming a bit more complicated, and obviously, like, online advertising is all about big data and how you use that data. That's what gives you your advantage. And that data has been relatively easy and free-flowing, but now some of the data is going away. Some of the data that we still will have is going to become maybe a little bit harder to use. So I think that's what makes all of this so interesting. We actually have a good question that I want to dive into here a bit. But Vince is asking a specific question about how these cohorts work, right? So say, in my example, and Vince, thank you very much for assuming I'm 35. I'm actually a bit older than that. But yes, and I do wear a red hat. So no, actually I don't wear red hats. So I just understood the red hats might mean something completely different here. So, but yes, say you have these attributes of a user. How do you figure that they're in a certain cohort, not a different cohort? And this is actually through a mechanism Google calls SIMHash. And what's nice about FLoC and TURTLEDOVE is that all of these are open source systems. So you can actually look at the code, you can see the implementations, and there's a lot of technical detail about it. But what Google is fundamentally doing is it's saying, well, here's the behaviors that this person has taken within their browser, and that's fed into a SIMHash algorithm. And SIMHash is basically saying, okay, let's take these behaviors and put that into a unique key. But it's not a unique key for every single behavior. It's called SIMHash for similar hashing, right? So two users who do kind of the same thing, but not exactly the same thing, would hash to the same key and the same cohort. And so that's where you're going to start seeing, perhaps somebody wearing a red hat and being 35 years old and visiting Mercedes might also fall in the same cohort as somebody visiting the BMW site. And by the way, the demographic aspect, and weigh in, Navah and Amy, but I don't think the fact that you're 35, that's not part of SIMHash, right? I mean, what we're talking about here is really what websites have you visited and what has your behavior been.
Yeah. 100%, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, and that's where it comes down to. So with SIMHash, I don't have to visit exactly Edmunds.com and Cars.com to fall into the same SIMHash as somebody who's visited similar sites about cars. And that's kind of the unknown. And I can't remember exactly how many cohorts would be in this first iteration, but it is actually limited. And so in SIMHash, you can set the binary length. And so that controls how many cohorts you can have. And I thought that the number in the initial phase was going to be relatively small. So that's kind of bad from a targeting perspective, right? Because a lot of people doing very different things are going to come into the same cohorts. So you lose a lot of precision. But the trade-off and the benefit is that you get a lot more privacy because it's unlikely that somebody would fall into a cohort by themselves. The other technical detail here, and again, please weigh in on this if you have any thoughts on it, but there's fundamentally a two-level system. So the first one is the assignment into a FLoC cohort. The second one is for that cohort to be able to be used, it has to pass a certain number of users. So even in the situation where there's only 5 people going into a cohort, Google has put in place a mechanism that says, well, even though you asked to show ads to this cohort, we're disallowing it because we haven't reached the minimum threshold for how many people are in it. So it's too likely you could actually figure out who these 5 people might be.
One thing, and we kind of touched on this in the Twitter thread leading up to this town hall, is ad platform performance is limited if you try to target too small a group. There is just a threshold where there just isn't enough data, there isn't a search volume, there just isn't going to be enough. So when we think about cohorts, number one, it's important to remember that the cohort is still going to compete in an auction with other audience types. So the basic premise of TurtleDove is that it's going to check to see what is the better match, what is the better bid, what is the what ad should win between one of these cohort audiences and just an in-market audience and what I like to call native audiences. The other thing to think about is just we are already used to, from a search standpoint, keywords with low search volume. There are just inherently going to be certain ideas, certain groups of folks that if we try to target them specifically, there just isn't enough for either the ad platform to justify the auction, because it's just that there isn't enough, so an ad's not going to serve. The other piece is when you think about the persona behind the cohort, I actually don't mind the loss of precision, because if I get too precise, I can pigeonhole myself into individual sales. And individual sales, while useful, don't have scale. So as we're thinking about targeting and how we position our creative, how we position our campaigns, this might actually be a very good kind of kick in the pants to think about what kind of audiences are we targeting, what kind of personas are we building, and how can our creative better serve a persona as opposed to an individual person and nagging them into giving us our money or their money.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and that sounds like a good strategy.
Yeah, and I would add to that, from an audience perspective too, we're already accustomed to, even if you upload an audience of email addresses, if it doesn't match to enough people, you can't use it. So I think we're all kind of already accustomed to ensuring that audience sizes are big enough. So this, I don't think that particular part of it is going to be hugely impactful, because it shouldn't be really, really different from what we're already used to.
Yeah, and then here we have a question. So if a cohort is not large enough, what about its availability? So again, let's dive into some of the technical details here to help you understand that. So the cohorting, or the FLoC scheme, is currently set to renew every week. So every week, Google would recalculate what cohort you fall into. Right, so it's more likely that this would be treated like a low search volume keyword, which means that you can still have the keyword and at some point it's just not serving, but you don't really know that. Google just gives you a flag that maybe it's not eligible, but then the next day, all of a sudden it could become eligible because more people are searching for that keyword. Same thing with these the FLoC mechanism, right? So there's a weekly recalculation of what cohort you fall into. I also want to bring up TurtleDove, right? So Navah, you kind of mentioned it, and I think we focused on FLoC a little bit so far. So FLoC, again, is about what behaviors have you done, what websites have you visited, and that assigns you to a cohort. There's a separate initiative which is called TurtleDove, and this is actually many iterations in, and all the iterations have been called a species of bird, but this is for remarketing. Okay, so 2 different types of audiences. They have different names, so kind of confusing. But TurtleDove is how do you remarket to someone? This is actually really interesting to me, because we're talking broadly about third-party cookies going away, right? So, but if somebody's been to my website and I want to remarket to them, is that not a first-party cookie? Like, why do we have to do something different here?
So, go ahead, Amy.
Oh, I was just going to say, so within Google's ecosystem, it should still be considered first party, because they're also considering all of that logged in data. So basically their walled garden, they're considering first party data as well. Where it starts to cross the lines with third party is when you start delivering ads on other publisher sites that you don't own, because third-party tracking is a big part of how those users are tracked. So that's where Fledge comes in. And essentially what that strives to do, so Fledge is an iteration of TurtleDove. TurtleDove was proposed to allow advertisers or ad tech companies to create cohorts based upon their own first-party data to try to inform what ads that particular consumer or group of consumers might see. Fledge was built upon TurtleDove. And basically, it expands on TurtleDove, and they're still continuing to iterate. I still expect to see more iterations of this. But it expands on it to include a way for on-device bidding algorithms to use additional information from a new trusted server. They're kind of vague on what a trusted server is, but it would be defined by compliance with certain principles and policies designed for this purpose. So they're still trying to be really careful with how that audience data is used.
Right. And one interesting point is that some of these initiatives have already been blocked in Europe under lack of GDPR compliance. So right now, these tests can only happen mostly in the United States. But yeah, it is fascinating, because the other point that you just made, Amy, is that the auction is partially shifting to the publisher's website. And this is, by the way, the whole thing, right? So to reframe the whole conversation a little bit, the way that Google has operated for a long time and the way that the internet has operated is there's the cloud, okay? And the cloud is basically Google's infrastructure of servers, and everything we've done, everything cool that we've been able to do in the last decade that's based on machine learning and artificial intelligence has relied on that supercomputer that happens to live in the cloud. For us to be able to leverage that, we've had to send data into it. So even if it was my data, my first party data, I had to send it to someone else to do something with it, and then they could send it somewhere else, right? And that's where the privacy generally tends to break down. Now, the reason that this happened was because the only supercomputer that could do these machine learning things was the one in the cloud. But the world has evolved, and now we have supercomputers in our pockets. We have iPhones, and they're much, much faster than anything people had, obviously, 10 years ago. So these devices can now do a lot of this processing, a lot of this classification, and very simple machine learning on the device itself. So it's the shifting of all the machine learning having to happen in the cloud to some of it can happen on the device, right? So that's how you can build cohorts. But now it also sounds like some of that is shifting to the browser, where the browser might be running on a computer, and the browser itself is powerful enough to actually do some of the computation to make that auction work. So it's a fundamental redistribution of where work is done in the internet that's teeing up these proposals.
One other thing I would just throw out there is that this is a really good time, if you're a publisher, to take stock of your ad tech partners and your ad tech suite. There is absolutely an opportunity to build your own solutions to serve those ads and to engage with those cohorts. That might actually be a more profitable equation and have better interface for you. So, I mean, the native ad platforms, anytime you're working with a Google, or if you're talking about the Facebook iOS ridiculousness, every single ad platform is going to make it very easy to buy ads through them. This is a time for you to disrupt potentially on the native side what those equations look like and what kind of relationships you're willing to have serve. One other note I did want to touch base on when it comes to first party data. When we think about domain structure, the main takeaway that I've have from this whole equation is how many vanity domains, how many country domains, how many subdomains do we have, and how many of those are actually going to be considered in our first party data set. So Jenny Marvin was very gracious to let us know that we have 5 per first party data set. But that is another consideration as you're thinking about how you're serving ads and kind of what kind of relationships you want to build, is how well you are equipping yourself to receive those first party data sets.
Right. And so this is an article, a post you did on Search Engine Journal. So let's talk about that a bit more, right? So you're talking about subdomains and really what qualifies as first party data.
Mm-hmm.
And so your advice is basically, if you're the PPC team and you need to have your own landing pages because otherwise the SEO team gets pissed off that you're breaking everything for them, it sounds like that's completely fine. However, there seems to be a limit, like Jenny Marvin from Google now is saying, on you can only have 5 subdomains connected to be like your first.
So to be clear, and I am hoping Jenny will respond to this video and clear up if this was misrepresented. Based off of the tweet and my advice is that you can have up to 5 vanity domains. It does appear like the country-specific domains and the subdomains, you can have as many as you want. It's just the core domain you can only have 5. So why that matters is if you have, for example, your domain structure as Bose USA and Bose Canada, but all of them are .coms, but the root domain structure is as opposed to just .co.uk or .ca or so on and so forth, that is going to require a migration. That is going to require some heavy lifting. If, however, your usa.bose.com or bose.com / Canada / UK / what have you, that also is fine. It's the specific vanity domains that can be an issue.
Yeah, and then thanks for clarifying that distinction. It's a pretty important one, right? The other point you made in the article, and I want to show this on screen here, what is the value of audiences, I think. So I think, was this your research?
Yes, this was a data set I put together back when I was at WordStream, based off of 21,000 Google accounts with at least $1 of spend. And one thing that broke my heart was that 14% of those that were in the cohort that I was looking at had no audiences associated, and they had terrible performance. So it was just the main moral of the story was if you have no audiences attached, your cost per acquisition is going to be high.
So this is the purple bar. It's a little bit hard to see, but the purple bar, really high cost per acquisition if you don't do anything with audience.
Correct. Whereas if you use customer lists, what I found really interesting was that that first party data where you've earned the email, you've earned that ability to communicate with the user beyond just following them around and nagging them to look at the ad, like they've actually given you that email, had a better cost per acquisition than website visitors. The similar audiences, which we all tend to be, poo-poo on Google. Google doesn't know how to discover good people for us, or even Facebook, poo-poo-poo. They don't know how to find us good folks. Those similar audiences actually performed from when you prospect off of that seed of the customer list or even the website visitors, better than website visitors. So the moral of the story from this data, or at least the lesson I took away, use audiences whenever possible, but the best possible audiences that you will be able to have are those that you've earned to have that continued conversation.
And there's a question that relates to this, right? So the blue box in that graph right there is for similar audiences, which also performs really well on a cost per acquisition basis. But Marilene is asking, what happens with similar audiences, right? And so his question was a little bit, if you have a cohort, but it's too small, can you like add some similar audiences to that?
So similar audiences, and this may change. Similar audiences are going to take that seed audience and find folks that are as similar as possible based off of their behaviors. So as FLoC and cookies, as the dust settles, we may see similar audiences improve, and it will enlarge that group. So you'll be able to target more effectively off of the cohort. You may also see those change, and you really would only want to do similar audiences off of your first party data exclusively, because there's a question of whether Google's able to get enough signals with these changes. So yes, root answer, yes, similar audiences expand your cohort, but the caveat is that we won't know whether they will maintain their performance level until after a couple of months where we're fully immersed in this new world.
Great. A couple more questions. Amy, I think maybe you'll have an answer for this one. But Stu is hopeful, I think, that for healthcare, remarketing might become available because the data is more privatized, so Google might have fewer concerns. What's your take on this one?
That's a really good question. From a remarketing standpoint, it's really hard to say. I think that they'll still probably be really careful around sensitive categories. But one of the things that really interests me is that beyond advertisers, the Fledge documentation actually highlights that third-party ad tech companies and publishers could create their own segments that they could then make available to advertisers. And the documentation suggests even that some businesses could have the ability to create and monetize some of that data. So one of the questions that I had asked Jenny Marvin in an interview that I did with her a couple of weeks ago was whether she sees Google offering a third-party audience exchange in the future. Just given that the documentation highlights some of those things, I was just wondering if Google Ads would potentially broker some of that functionality. And her response was that they plan to deepen their support for solutions that build on direct relationships between consumers and the brands and publishers that they engage with. So to me, that sounds pretty promising, that even for some of those categories that can't currently remarket, there may be more audiences available to them through publishers or potentially other ad tech, which may be monetized, so that could be good or bad. But I think that there will be a lot of audience opportunities for us in the future, maybe even more than what we have now.
One conjecture point, I don't know that we will have access to that improved remarketing and targeting functionality until the ad platforms pass the regulatory scrutiny that they're currently in. So I don't necessarily see any industries that are currently limited or not eligible to target magically being eligible to target because of FLoC and the privacy associated. I 1000% agree that it paves the way for a potential. I just don't think it's realistic to see those sorts of solutions until it's fully rolled out, and B, Congress isn't, and the legislation in the EU breathing down the ad platforms necks.
Right. So let's talk about timeline. I mean, FLoC is happening now; it's being developed. But when are we losing third-party cookies, and when should we expect GDPR compliance? Let's conject.
Well, I mean, 2022. They said 2022. So I'm planning on having all ducks in order and pushing all of the folks in my sphere to have their ducks in order by December 31st, 2021, because it is. I mean, it's already getting rolled out to a certain extent. So.
Right, now's the time to start testing, start playing with it, start to understand it. And if it faces delays, well, great, then at least we're ready ahead of time, but we can still use the old thing until it really goes away. But that said, I mean, so Google's not the only player, right? So a lot of this, iOS is changing the rules and the apps are changing the rules. So in some way, we need these solutions sooner rather than later because we're already being blocked on big parts of our traffic.
Yeah, and we have to also remember that FLoC is only specific to Google Chrome. So at least I haven't heard anything about any other browsers adopting it at this point. So when you think about external ad networks outside of Google Ads, this creates some complexity for them because they have to figure out how do they adopt FLoC, and then if other browsers don't adopt FLoC, do they use different identifiers with different browsers? And then just from a GDPR standpoint, the concern right now, I think, with FLoC is that what Google was trying to do is replace third-party cookies with a way that publishers and advertisers could still work together, because they knew that if they didn't create a way for advertisers and publishers to work together, then somebody else would. And that could be more invasive, and it could be more damaging, potentially even than third-party cookies. But the critics of FLoC currently are saying, right now you still could do a fingerprint of somebody, and not only would you have their fingerprint, which already narrows down who they potentially are, but now you combine that with their FLoC, And now it makes it a lot easier to figure out exactly who they are. So they're still working out ways to make sure that it's really protecting people's privacy as opposed to doing the opposite.
Yeah, so a lot of this is going to evolve. And then also the FLoC mechanism, again, it's described, it's an open API, so there's no restriction that it can only be used by Google. It's just a matter of, do the other browsers decide to adopt it? And I think there was just a story about, what was it? DuckDuckGo did something? No, doesn't ring a bell. I read something about somebody saying we're not going to participate.
Yeah, that was DuckDuckGo. Yeah.
And how does that actually matter? I mean, they're a search engine and they're already like the private search engine.
It doesn't really change much for me. I don't think. I guess I wasn't really surprised by it. They're already, so they already are so focused on privacy that I wasn't surprised to hear them say they weren't going to support it. But just given that they're a search engine, I'm not exactly sure what signals. I'm not exactly sure how the role of a search engine at this point.
Yeah, maybe
I have
get some free press.
That was my cynical response, is that they're just looking, like, when they, I don't know if folks saw that Twitter thread that DuckDuckGo put out of, here's all the things that Google was collecting on you. Look at them. Look how terrible they're being. So I feel like a lot of the content that's coming out right now that isn't concrete, here's what to do, here's how to do it, is very PR oriented. Like, as much as I'm very excited about the new attribution visibility that we're going to have for display in YouTube, there's an email that went out to today. I feel like the timing of it was very pointed, especially with Facebook stuff. So my advice is take any communication, any stance that an ad platform or browser takes as PR first, unless it's very specific. Here's what to do, here's why to do it, so on and so forth.
Yeah. Okay, let's take one more question that's not tactical, and then we're going to jump into exactly what to do. And sorry, they just changed the comment on the screen, but the question was, so yes, could Congress say we don't like this? Yeah, I guess Congress can do that.
So net neutrality is a good example here. We all feared, or at least I feared, net neutrality when it was introduced, when it was going to be taken away, and it, like, the fact that the government has such control over what is basically a human need at this point. It ended up being more fear than actual negative outcomes. So I don't actually think the fear of Congress saying nope is warranted in this case, especially because this is actually very compliant with what they, like, the angle that they're pushing for. But yeah, that's my 2 cents.
Right, and I suppose that's part of this whole conversation, and why I want to have this conversation is there's a lot of unknowns, but the more that, at least in the PPC community, we can sort of understand what's happening and communicate it clearly to others who are not in the PPC community. Let's have a conversation that's based on facts as opposed to sentiments, because eventually we know a congressman is not a PPC expert, nor can we expect him to be, but we want them to, get balanced information that helps them make the right decision. All right, let's get a little bit specific here. And we've got an article from Michelle Morgan that we're going to show in a minute. But how will companies target ads to cohorts, right? So if somebody visits their site, do they have to target those IDs? And I think that's actually the distinction here between remarketing versus audience targeting. So for the remarketing to someone who's been to your site, you'd use Fledge and TURTLEDOVE. And for finding people who haven't yet been to your site but seem to be interested and might be good visitors, you'd be looking at figuring out the cohort ID. And that's the thing we don't quite know yet, and that Amy was talking about before. So I don't know if we want to say it again, but how do we target a cohort ID?
Yeah, so I think, so essentially what's going to happen is your browser is going to assign you into a cohort based upon your browsing history, and that browsing history will not be shared back. It will stay within your browser. And then as you visit different sites, if they request that cohort ID, your browser will then give them that cohort ID. But it sounds like it will be up to those websites themselves to determine exactly what that cohort ID means. And this is another thing that has, I've seen it spark a little bit of discussion just around the fact that the sites will be able to acquire those cohort IDs, and they may be able to match eventually your name to that cohort ID. So there are some privacy concerns with that as well. But it sounds like at this point, they won't be really receiving much information with that cohort ID. I'm sure over time, they'll be able to learn things about those cohort IDs. If they see a lot of people coming from 1, 2, 3, 4 are going to the SUV page, then they'll start to understand that that's a cohort of people that are interested in SUVs. But it sounds like kind of out of the gate, there's not going to be a lot of information provided in that sense. I have a suspicion that on the advertiser end of things, that the ad platforms are going to step in and make some of that a little bit more simplified, so that we as advertisers are not having to keep track of series of codes and numbers. So I expect that that will be translated before it comes back to the advertiser, but that's what the exchange between the browser and the publisher looks like.
But what's so weird about that to me and like the unknown is, how do you name or identify a cohort when it could be based on such a variety of jumbled together signals, right? Because all the examples I'm giving is like, it's an automotive buyer, right? But that's not me. Like, I'm in the market for a car, but I really got into archery lately. It's really fun. It's a great way to go into nature with the kids. But I'm like, hey, maybe I need a rangefinder, right? So that's another thing I'm shopping for. And then I really like certain sports teams, so I'm looking at that. So how does all of that entirety of my behavior puts me into a cohort, right? And you can't see me anymore, so let's put some other people on the screen. But that's the entirety of the cohort. But how do you specifically go after someone who is just looking for cars, right? And you don't care about the fact that they're looking for a rangefinder to do archery, for example.
So one thing to think about, in-market audiences have trained us by and large how to think about those general groupings. But this is where I think a lot of the lead gen folks should have a conversation with e-commerce folks. E-commerce is used to thinking about product groups and product types. And my guess, and again, this is a guess, is that these cohorts are going to behave in a very similar way of getting tagged in browsers, understanding that something goes into XYZ product group or product type. And as we know, depending on the product group and product type that you designate for your product will either end up on exactly the right search result page or exactly the wrong search result page. So maybe this is me being naively hopeful, but everything that's been released, it feels like it follows patterns that we're familiar with. The idea of tagging something according to the largest common denominator, the idea of, okay, this person is expressed by the places they've gone, by the interactions that they've done, various interests. These people also express those various interests cohort. So, but again, this might be extremely naive, and it could be far more technical than that. But it's based off of everything that's been released. It does feel like it's following the pattern of feed management and product groups and product types, and just traditional audience targeting.
Yeah, and I don't know the answer. I mean, some of the documentation I've read seems to be that Google is pushing the classification or the naming of the cohorts onto third parties. So I'm like, hey, sweet, Optmyzr can do that. We can help our customers with it. In fact, I'd love it if Google didn't do it at all. Give people another reason to stay with Optmyzr. But it doesn't sound like that would be the reasonable thing to do. So, but again, a lot of guessing at this point. And these are also good questions to ask, right? And I think, to be fair, a lot of PMs within Google don't necessarily have answers at this point. This is a big topic of discussion, and they're trying to figure it out. And, as things evolve and as regulatory bodies respond, things are constantly shifting. But voice these concerns and, make sure you're using things in the right way. It was sort of funny, and this is unrelated, but the broad match modified sunsetting, like we did a study and we saw that 95% of advertisers didn't use it as it was intended, right? And then Google pulls it away. So it's like, well, of course Google is going to pull it away because you didn't use it the way it was supposed to be used. I think with audiences, clearly we all love them. We love remarketing. We're using it well. But communicate it to Google, like make sure everybody's on the same page and knows how important it is to you. So for example, the data that Navah had, like what was it, 2 or 3x improvement in cost per acquisition when you actually layer an audience on top of something, like that's meaningful, and make sure Google understands like that if you took away audiences altogether, right, and my cost goes up 3x, well, maybe I don't have money to put it in Google anymore. Maybe I have to put it somewhere else. Yeah, share all information was one of the principles of innovation at Google, because that makes people do the right thing. Amy?
And one other thing I wanted to mention too is in my conversation with Jenny Marvin, I had asked about just all of the audience reporting that we're accustomed to. So knowing how different audiences are performing within our search campaigns, knowing that which types of audiences are coming to our website, even if we're not advertising on those audiences. And it sounds like that type of data will still be available when you think about trying to decide which cohorts to target, we should have some level of data at our disposal to understand who's coming to our site currently and how they're behaving. At least I hope so. That's what it sounds like. So it won't be kind of like completely playing in the dark, but I definitely think there could be a role for ad tech, to your point, Fred, to step in and help make that easier for advertisers as well.
Yeah. Okay, we only have a few minutes left, but what are you doing to get ready, and any new ways that you're building your first-party data for when third-party data becomes inaccessible?
So I wanted to just throw this out there. I know building up first-party data is probably the highest priority on everybody's mind right now. But kind of one sidestep from that I just wanted to mention that nobody's really talking about, but in terms of getting ready is kind of the last big shift that we saw in privacy was when Google started mapping search terms. And all of the documentation around FLoC talks about how we will no longer be able to see what types of sites that people visited or their browser history. And we know that as advertisers as our placement tracking. So nobody's really mentioning this, but it really sounds to me like placement tracking is going away. So I'm kind of thinking of it as if you knew that search terms were going away, just having all of that data that you had and making sure that you're adding just copious exclusions so that in the future, you already have all those negatives in place. I don't know how negative placements will act in the future, but presuming that you can keep the negative placements that you have, I would just say go through your placements and make sure that you're adding a lot of negatives. Nobody has confirmed that they're going away, but all of the documentation says that we won't be able to see people's browsing history. So to me, that says that they are. So that's one thing that I would just say. I'm not seeing a lot of talk about it, but that would be a big focus for me in addition to making sure that we're building up our first party audiences.
That's great advice. And that also, I think, is another push towards smart bidding, right? We don't need placement exclusions. We don't need keywords even if we've correctly communicated the value of a conversion to Google, right? And so that's one of the things that I keep advocating. Automation's here to stay. It's only getting bigger. The way that you get it to do the job correctly is give it all the information, and that means correctly telling it what is a conversion, and not just what's a lead, but like, did that lead actually convert? And when that lead converted, was it a good long-term lead, high lifetime value, low lifetime value? Like, start to make those distinctions, because that does feed back into all of this machine learning. And if it knows that a certain placement, even if it can't tell you what that placement is, but it knows it's a bad placement, it's going to bid down. It's going to bid the correct value, right? So our focus has to be on managing the communication of information into Google as opposed to trying to micromanage everything.
Yeah, and I think Navah made a great point earlier, which is that automation tends to perform best when you give it a lot of data. So moving into larger cohorts, versus some of the smaller audiences that we may be used to may actually benefit automation in that way.
Yeah. Quick question here. Could one consumer have many cohort IDs? So the answer to that, I believe, is no.
I don't think so.
Exactly. And also think about one consumer is not really one consumer, right? So it is based on your browser. So it is that browser's everyone using it. And probably in the logged in state. So the Google Chrome would know that, okay, here on this browser version, I'm logged in as myself. This is my work profile. So that'd be two browsers, each having their own cohort IDs. But it would be unique and it would be refreshed initially once per week, eventually probably more quickly. Navah, what are you doing to get ready?
Well, number one, I went and joined Justuno. So pretty much my biggest advice is get your on-page CRO house intact. Regardless of whether you use a software, regardless of whether you do this in-house, regardless of how you do it. I think a lot of folks make the mistake of only thinking about the campaign and the targeting and what they can do at the account level, and not thinking about what does the individual user look like, to Fred's point, lifetime customer value. What kind of messaging are you putting on the page? What kind of cross-department initiatives are you working on? So layering in your tech SEO and your content SEO teams, your social teams. So the biggest advice I have is, get everyone together in a room and come out with a migration plan. If you're a big company, I think the smaller companies are honestly going to be fine. This will be one of those things that two kings are going to battle, and the peasants don't really care, don't really notice. It could be one ruler or another. They don't really care. SMBs, to be frank, I don't think will be as impacted by this, particularly since ad platforms have built in so many amazing resources. It's the larger folks, particularly international folks, that will want to get that game plan in place. So you're getting your landing page URL structure intact, making sure that your email lists are GDPR compliant, and that you have an easy way to feed them back into the ad platforms for cross-channel targeting, but also attribution.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. So kind of get GDPR compliant even if you're not in Europe, because everybody eventually is going to have to play by rules kind of like that.
Mm-hmm.
Amy, what about you? Any final thoughts?
Yeah, I would say, like I mentioned, adding negative placements, but then also just looking at all of the different ways that you can start to build up those email lists. I think are going to be really, really valuable. And to Navah's point, making sure that your CRO is top notch is part of that. And then also just potentially also looking at other channels that you may not have tested in the past to see if there are different lead gen opportunities for you that might allow you to generate leads at a super low cost that then could be leveraged in other channels, both including email as well as paid ads in the future.
Great. Final point for me, we've got our virtual conference on Level, May 18th. At the bottom of the screen, that's where you can sign up for it. So we'd love to have you join us, whether you're a customer of Optmyzrs or not. Going to have great educational tracks, as well as some tracks specific to Optmyzr product and roadmap. But yeah, thanks everyone for joining us. This has been a really fun conversation. Amy, Navah, it's great to have you on again. Hopefully we can do this again when we know the next set of things about FLoC or whatever it's called at that point. But yeah, we got a couple of months here to get ready, focus on your first party data, get ready for a more private web because it is happening. And the ones of us who move quickly and are ready to go when that happens, we're going to be the ones doing really well in advertising, competitive advantage. So thanks for participating in the session today, and we'll see you for the next one. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.